Welcome to lecture number 91, historical topic 8.8, the Vietnam War. The theme is America in the world. You may have just watched lecture number 90 about America as a world power and noticed that the Vietnam War was entirely absent from that lecture. The reason for that is that the Vietnam War got its own historical topic and learning objective, that is, explain the causes and effects of the Vietnam War. The first key concept starts with some of the causes. Post-war decolonization and the emergence of powerful nationalist movements in Asia led both sides in the Cold War to seek allies among new nations, many of which remained non-aligned. This key concept was in the last lecture, but this slide puts this claim in context of the Vietnam post-colonial history. Vietnam used to be a French colony before World War II, but was invaded by the Japanese. Ho Chi Minh created the League for the Independence of Vietnam to fight off against the Japanese and French. At the end of World War II, France tried to reclaim it as a colonial territory, but there was a greater resistance from the Vietnamese people, enough that France gave them some degree of self-independence. Two governments emerged at the end of this, divided by the 17th parallel. A communist government in the north under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, and an anti-communist government in the south led by Ngo Dinh Diem. The US supported Diem for trying to keep communism from spreading, but Diem was unpopular with the South Vietnamese. Diem assumed dictatorial powers and repressed opposition. He was a staunch Roman Catholic and was particularly unpopular with the Buddhists for discriminatory policies that favored Catholics in Vietnam, a country that was 70 to 90% Buddhist. Pictures of both leaders are shown on the slide, Diem on the left meeting with Eisenhower and Secretary of State Dulles, while Ho Chi Minh is pictured with East German sailors. The US continued to support Diem from 1955 to 1961 until he started to lose favor with his own people. When he grew to be too unpopular, the US pulled their support from Diem and instead facilitated a military coup that arrested and killed him in 1963. One more measure of US intervention in the region, driven by the fear of the Domino theory, was when the Secretary of State John Foster Dulles helped create a defense pact with Southeast Asian countries in 1954, which included some outside countries like the UK, France, Australia, and New Zealand. The next key concept explains why the US gets more involved in Vietnam. Concerned by expansions of communist ideology and Soviet repression, the United States sought to contain communism through a variety of measures, including military engagement in Vietnam. President Kennedy was inaugurated as president in 1961, right around the same time that Ngo Dinh Diem started to lose favor among his own people. To try and maintain some sort of order in South Vietnam, the United States began sending military advisors, in quotations. They were supposed to be soldiers that were in non-combat roles, but that wasn't always the case. In November 1963, a couple of weeks before Kennedy was assassinated himself, Diem was overthrown and killed. Less than 1 year after President Johnson took over, in August 1964, there was an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin off the shores of North Vietnam. American ships were supposedly attacked by North Vietnamese Navy, and that gave President Johnson the reason he needed to ask Congress to send troops to contain the North Vietnamese from spreading communism to South Vietnam. At the peak of the Vietnam War, the U.S. had 500,000 troops in Vietnam. In 1968, the United States had been fighting for 4 years and started to grow its involvement in the region. During the Lunar Year holiday, the North Vietnamese attacked U.S. bases across all of South Vietnam. This was called the Tet holiday, so the attack came to be called the Tet Offensive. The United States repelled most of the attacks and neither side gained a decisive victory, but because of the publicity that it generated, the American people start to see that the war was not going quite as well as their elected officials had been telling them. Disgruntled Americans began protesting around the United States and their involvement in Vietnam, and a lot of them were started by young people across college campuses. The discontent amongst Americans discouraged LBJ from running for a second full term, and withdrew from the race at the end of March 1968. The assassination of Robert Kennedy and the chaos that was the 1968 convention left the party weak and opened the door for Richard Nixon to win the presidency. Johnson's administration was trying to end the war or at least come to a ceasefire. A recent biography on Richard Nixon actually claims that his campaign stalled the peace talks through back channels to give himself a better chance at winning the election. He indirectly promised the North Vietnamese to keep fighting until Nixon was elected, at which point there would be more favorable terms for peace. When President Nixon took office in 1969, his administration implemented a new strategy called Vietnamization. President Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, knew that the Vietnam War was unpopular and that they needed to get out, but they needed to do it in a way that would not make it seem like the United States lost. Their Vietnamization strategy meant that they were going to supposedly train new South Vietnamese troops to take the place of withdrawn American troops. The U.S. would continue to send South Vietnam military aid and supplies, but they would no longer be sending American soldiers to fight. Eventually, this worked with moderate success. American soldiers began to leave Vietnam, and so therefore American casualties declined. By 1973, both North and South Vietnam signed a Paris Accords to stop fighting and to allow the American troops to leave. The fighting resumed shortly, and in 1975, when American troops were close to evacuating all of their personnel, the North Vietnamese army took control of Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital. The last key concept says Americans debated the appropriate power of the executive branch in conducting foreign and military policy. This is a result of the discontent from Americans on how the war was conducted. They weren't happy, so they started to wonder how much power the president should have in conducting the war. At the beginning of the escalation, LBJ got Congress authorization to send troops into Vietnam through a congressional resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was not a formal declaration of war, which gave the president greater power in moving troops without the need for a formal declaration. As the war progressed, the American people found out about questionable actions by the U.S. in Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder was a blanket bombing campaign of North Vietnam. The United States started to use chemical weapons like napalm in the thick jungles to smoke out guerrilla units, but would also put civilians at risk. The U.S. also carried out bombing campaigns in neighboring countries of Cambodia and Laos. The North Vietnamese were using these countries as transportation routes to go past the American defenses at the South Vietnamese border. The U.S. military carried out war crimes in the My Lai massacre in 1968. In this massacre, U.S. soldiers killed and raped civilians in their search for Viet Cong guerrillas and weapons. Many of the victims were raped, mutilated, or tortured before being killed. The massacre went largely unreported for a year until it sparked outrage in the U.S. in 1969. The lieutenant who was in charge of the company that carried out was court-martialed and was sentenced to life in prison. However, his sentence was later reduced to 20 years, and he only served 3 under house arrest. The first black box on the screen that's about to disappear is going to reveal some of the atrocities committed at My Lai. In 1971, a report commissioned by the Department of Defense on the U.S. involvement in the war from 1967 was leaked to the New York Times and Washington Post. They revealed that the government had been consistently lying to the public about the true nature of the war, the likelihood of success, and the extent of the U.S. involvement. This report was what made public American operations in Laos and Cambodia. The Pentagon Papers shifted public opinion against the war and led to protests across college campuses. Students would burn their draft cards as a sign of support for the anti-war movement. Sometimes these protests were put down violently by the National Guard, as was the case in the 1970 Kent State Massacre. In their efforts to disperse the student protesters, the National Guard fired into the crowd of unarmed protesters and killed 4 students. The second box that's about to disappear will reveal an image from the aftermath of that protest. As a result of the backlash, politicians began to run on anti-war agendas. In the 1968 election, Senator Eugene McCarthy challenged President Johnson in the 1968 primary. McCarthy was nearly the Democratic nominee since President Johnson pulled out of the race in March and Robert Kennedy was assassinated 2 months before the convention. However, at the last minute, the convention passed over McCarthy and chose Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's sitting vice president, to run in the general election. Congress also reacted by passing the War Powers Act, also called the War Powers Resolution, to clarify the roles of the president and Congress in the decision to use military force. The act requires the president to consult with Congress before committing U.S. forces to armed conflict and to report to Congress on the conduct of the conflict. The act does allow the president to commit troops for up to 60 days without congressional approval, with an additional 30-day withdrawal period. But if they need troops for any longer, they will need congressional approval. The constitutionality of this has yet to be tested, and it's not clear that it has had its intended effect in curbing the power of the executive in matters of war. Now here's the recap. The United States sought to keep dominoes from falling in Southeast Asia, and this is the entire reason why the United States was so active in military conflicts. The Gulf of Tonkin attacks drew the United States into the conflict. The war was devastating to the Vietnamese, and between 1 to 2 million Vietnamese people were estimated to have died, and 58,000 American soldiers were casualties of this war.
Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back in the next lecture.